so much for attending the afternoon session. This afternoon, we're going to be spending the next 30 minutes or so talking about global cybersecurity and cyber war. My name is John Daniele. I'm joined by my two esteemed colleagues, Chris Anderson and Mr. Paul Meyer. Chris Anderson has over 30 years experience in risk, security, cybersecurity risk and compliance. He's worked for many Big Four organizations and other regulatory bodies setting standards in our industry. And Mr. Paul Meyer is a fellow in international security and adjunct prof of international studies at Simon Fraser University. Just wanted to spend the next minute framing the conversation today. I've spent about 20 years of my career in cybersecurity engaged in working for defense organizations and law enforcement organizations on a variety of different concerns, everything from actually the development of cyber weapons, the engagement of cyber war, to defensively operating, catching cyber criminals, and working on investigations. So got a pretty broad base of experience on both sides of the conversation, from defense to offense. And just wanted to frame the conversation by looking far into the future in terms of what society might look like the more that we integrate technology with all aspects of our life and living. It's hard to envision how cybersecurity today is necessarily going to present an imminent threat to human existence. But 100 years from now, 200 years from now, when we have biology that is integrated with technology to a greater or lesser extent. Today we have pacemakers with wireless devices. Tomorrow, 100, 200 years from now, we may have our own bodies just more fully integrated with technology. If we have not solved the moral and ethical challenges presented by the use of this kind of technology before we actually reach that point of integration, cybersecurity concerns could very well oppress an entire people. Could very well be used to cause devastating physical harm and damage. So I know that sounds a bit like a far off distant future right now, but that is what I think we're probably hurtling towards, and we need to really tackle these challenges ahead of time. We need to come to some consensus about what are the norms that we're going to adopt at an international level in terms of what is a cyber attack, what are acceptable cyber behaviors, and what's not acceptable. So I'll now pass it on to my two panelists. Chris Anderson has a few things to say on the matter.
Thanks, John, and to thank you for putting this on, and everyone that's spoken today and tomorrow. I look forward to hearing from you as well. As John said, I'm a information security, controls and compliance professional. Worked in consulting and auditing for a long time, and I've also had corporate roles. And so for me,
cyber attack.
Yeah. For me, this is great because I'm getting to meet and talk to people that are not like me, and learning about issues and risks that affect society and business and us personally that are outside my normal sort of community. And so I'm learning so much today, and I look forward to learning more tomorrow. Anyway, I've got a short period of time, so I'm going to sort of do the highlights. Like many speakers before, I could spend all day talking about this stuff. But sort of cyber attacks, what do we know? Well, what we know, and you all read the news or see the news on TV. If you think about the last 2, 5, 10 years, it used to be back, in the 90s, say, the only people that heard about security breaches or attacks were people that were in the industry. And then it became more into the business arena. And now it's basically on the front page, on your TV, all the time. And so that's a tell, but it's really the tip of the iceberg. What we know about cyber attacks that have occurred is literally the tip of the iceberg. Some or many cyber attacks are never disclosed and never will be, either because of their military, and basically it's all secret. Unless the attackers that are successful out the information. The smart people that that are attacking each other at that level, they're so sophisticated that their approach is to get in, steal the data that they're looking for, cover all their tracks and get out. It's not a vandalistic sort of exercise, right? So it's very subtle, and their idea is to preserve the fact that they were never there if they could, so they can keep maybe milking the cow or keep using those techniques and tools for other targets. And then there's the people that have been hacked and don't know it. And based on the experience that I've seen, and work that John's done, many of your home computers, many organizations' computers, even regulated industries like banks, their computers are full of viruses and full of backdoors and all sorts of funny things that have crept in, because this is an asymmetric issue. And I'll use the analogy of, South American cocaine drug dealers trying to get cocaine into the North America. The economics is, I'll run 10 boats out of South America to go to Florida. The Coast Guard has to prevent them all to be successful. The economics for the boatload of cocaine is I get one through and I'm happy, right? So it's an asymmetric problem, like many sort of attack protection issues. Now, in terms of what do we know, I've got a number of articles. I'm just going to tell you about them just for the sake of time. If you want to read a good current article, these are easy to find now on the internet. But if you Google something called the Cyber Cold War, the silent but persistent threat to nation states. Okay, it's a very recent article, just literally came up about a week ago, on something called the IT Pro Portal. If you just Google that, the Cyber Cold War, the silent but persistent threat to nation states. This is going on all the time. And as I said, at that sophisticated level, they don't actually smash the window on the way in to steal the jewelry in the front of the store. They're very subtle about it. There are nation states involved. I'm sure you're not surprised about this. Yeah, the big one that got talked about 5 or 6 years ago now was called APT1, Advanced Persistent Threat Number 1. It probably wasn't the first one, but basically a security firm did all the work to figure out who this was that was basically persistently attacking a bunch of government and businesses. And they basically ended up taking a photo of a great big building in a city in China. And they said, there's basically a whole division of the People's Republic Army in there. And they're not wearing guns. And the amount of power being consumed by this building is not just keeping the lights on per se, right? And so they said, there are divisions literally of the Chinese army that are doing this. And that's just one example. Another example of how persistent this is, back about 10 years ago, I did a lot of work in the credit card security world. And I had the privilege of working with a gentleman who advised me about how to do this work and help companies get compliant, which does not mean secure. Let's get that very clear, right? But get compliant, which is a good couple of steps on the road to secure. And this gentleman, Bashir Fancy, was the retired head of audit and security for Visa International. And the stories that he told me made me lose whatever hair I had left. Their adversaries were highly organized crime. They were better organized than most companies. They were virtual. They had people that wrote code. They had people that knocked out, that injected that code into either ATMs or in checkout counters in your local grocery store. They had people that then got those numbers, inventoried them, and then used them as they could to get money, for other purposes, right? When they finally cracked one of these outfits down in Florida, they went into a room and these guys had business plans. And they had targeted companies that they were going to do next. And they profiled all the people who they could try and turn to try and get a back door just the easy way, right? So this is the nature of the beast. And that stuff is what they call the threat of choice. Companies with valuable information are targeted. But on the way to that, there could be what they call threats of opportunity. If an organization or you at home with your computers have weak security, then you can be co-opted or just be target practice. right? So thinking that since I don't have anything of value means I'm not going to get whacked or get my computer knocked over is naive. John can sort of talk a bit more. I know John does what is called in the industry threat hunting right now. So through this conversation, maybe he can share a bit about that. So as I was talking to Meta quickly, right now in business, the big agenda is privacy of customer data. And that does matter, and it's been part of my career in terms of helping companies put adequate security in for either privacy of individual information or confidentiality of their intellectual property, whatever other information that they have. And you know, if your personal information gets compromised and I steal some money out of your bank account, most likely the banks will put it back, right? And I can take a mortgage out in your name, and fixing that can take 2 years. That's bloody awful. It's a pain in the ass. You know, I had a partner when I was at Grant Thornton who was a forensic accountant. It took her 2 years to fix that problem. And she knew what to do. She knew which buttons to push and which regulators to go and see and what forms to fill out and all that. Like John said, you know, the future presents great opportunity, but potentially, you know, symmetrically with that great threat. The beginning of that is the term, you know, Neta brought it up, the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things has been around for a while. But what's happening now is, over and above this threat of personal information being compromised and that causing some damage to a large group of people or a small or many groups of people, with the Internet of Things, technologies that were once isolated in their own manufacturing environment, or what they call SCADA systems, supervisory control and data acquisition systems for utilities, right? They were physically bounded by the building that they were in. In order for someone to tamper with them, they had to get in the building. And in some of those buildings, they actually had guards and guns and doors and all those great security things. Well, now someone went and put what they call a TCP/IP stack on top of that process control system or that network and connected it to the internet. On the other side of the firewall, if they have one done properly, is, you know, 3 billion of your worst enemies. And they don't live here, so they can do whatever they like, and there's nothing that can be done about it, right? So the Internet of Things presents risks because these things were never designed to be connected to the World Wide Web or the internet. Secondly, even the Internet of Things that are new, right, they're made cheaply. You know, the sensors for food cooling temperature sensing in a fridge, the sensors that might be part of your home security system, they're made cheaply. If they have any ability to manage them, they're using open source browsers, which are free, which is really cheap. Now you get what you pay for. So you've heard the stories just recently about someone had conversations when their Alexa system was up, and suddenly that sent a message to someone because the Alexa system interpreted what they were saying, recorded it, and then somehow interpreted something else that they said, and sent that message that got captured off to someone else. Totally unexpected. But the Internet of Things problem is going to create great opportunities for us. But the threat now changes from compromise of personal data or compromise of intellectual property to loss of life and limb. You know, if a healthcare system somehow gets data wrong and then injects or tells a patient care person to inject someone with the wrong information or the wrong dose, or if your home security system fails, someone breaks in and steals your valuable property or hurts you. If driverless cars or automated car systems that even now, even if you drive, they say, okay, trust us to keep you in the lane or trust us to not smack into the thing in front of you. If those systemically fail, or the smart city type things fail, people are going to get hurt. So the calculus has changed. I still believe that loss of data is very important. But on the sort of scale, if you think of a PowerPoint about, you know, risks, it used to be loss, you know, a lot of data was the big thing on the PowerPoint. Well, that now goes to here, because over here we've got people going to get hurt and die. So what do we do about it? Like what we talked about just in the last discussion about pandemics, organizations, you as your own sort of, in effect, IT manager for your home, governments, all have to ensure they've got a good security program. This is obvious. And it's not only protect and put in good security measures, but it's also, you are going to get whacked anyway. So you need to have the ability to detect that occurred, respond to it, and fix it up. So it's sort of like that pandemic or that organismic health model. The things that I've seen in my career that are the blind spots that might be, you know, something to think about in terms of a proposal for this forum is, it's one thing to say, here's my organization or my house, and I'm going to put in place a good security management system and program. But what I've seen in my career, in my experience, is people forget that they've got peeps have peeps, people have peeps, right? So an organization has a service provider, simple example, payroll, or simple example, a call center, or simple example, you know, system administration. They're not part of your organization, but they are now intertwined and embedded into your IT systems. What's their security like? And who are their third parties? And who are their third parties? And unless you actually pull those gossamer threads, right, you really don't understand. Hands up who remembers the Target hack. Target? Target, you know, the store. The store? I think so. The Target store. Does everyone remember that Target hack? A few of you, right? Okay, how it happened, it wasn't Target's per se security, although it was, but it wasn't their security. They had a HVAC supplier in Pennsylvania who was looking after HVAC on a number of Target stores around there. And this small company, on Friday, VPN'd in to put in his service orders and completed work and etc. What the hackers did is sit in his little company's network and waited for him to VPN to Target, and then they rode that rail in, right? So it's the third parties is a blind spot, right? Secondly, if you look at the IoT and the products that we need to trust that won't hurt us, if I look back at the 40 or 50 years of computing industry, which industry, apart from the IT software industry, has gotten away with saying, you're going to pay me a pile of money for my product, but the efficacy of that product and its ability to perform is not my problem. And we've been seduced into believing that's acceptable, right? If you ever read all that stuff, you say, I agree about the software, which no one reads, right? I do because I'm a geek. But if you read it, it says, this software is basically on an as-is basis. If it fails to function properly, too bad. If you don't set it up perfectly, too bad, right? And so, you know, would you accept that from a fridge? Would you accept that from your car, right? No. So we as society have failed to demand proper quality and efficacy of the hardware and the system software products that we have now got all intertwined in our lives. There is a solution to that, which is just not being used well. But there is a standard, the ISO standard, it's 15408. And in the military world, it's genesised on something called the common criteria. And back in the 60s, if anyone's from the military world, if you might remember something called the Orange Book. Well, it's not about Agent Orange. The Orange Book and all that stuff was the military saying, in order for us to trust computing for military purposes, here's a set of criteria from sort of C2 to C1, B2 to B1 and A, more and more rigorous to say under what circumstances can we trust this for very important things. That has now been moved from the military arena into the commercial arena under that standard called 15408. It's just that no one really demands this out of most IT products, right? But there's something that we can use as a genesis to move forward. End of my talk.
Oh, wow. Slow down.
So you guys are going to assemble here to, and is Peggy Mason going to be part of this?
No, that was nice.
Oh. So John, why don't you sit down with a list the audio is problematic. Oh, no,
It's better than their.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. Yes, call and call to whatever, then we can do our Q&A.
So I don't know if Paul is live and wanted to say a few things before we get to the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, John. I did want to say a few things. And I think the discussion we've heard now just shows you how complex and difficult it is to deal with the cybersecurity issue, because everything gets lumped in under the rubric of cyber attacks. You know, we have everything from the individual scammer who wants you to finance the lost wallet of your favorite aunt, to the University of Calgary, I believe, that gets its information and its records subject to a ransomware, to what Chris was describing, sophisticated state-conducted espionage actions that are trying to ensure that they exfiltrate your information without leaving any clues or traces to that, to the area that, frankly, I'm more concerned about, which is the military uses of cyber operations and payloads as a weapon that destroys, disrupts the data, that can, in fact, also have kinetic effects. And I think over the last years, we've seen a rampant militarization of cyberspace, which I find, frankly, extremely problematic. I mean, this is, after all, a human-created environment that is overwhelmingly owned and operated and used by civilians. And I don't recall, maybe I was sleeping at the time, a referendum being held by the 3+ billion users of the internet, whether they're amenable to having their internet militarized, so that their operations become subject to the caprices of state leaders or even lesser beings in state agencies as to what activities will be permitted. So this is a process that has come about and without much public scrutiny or public debate, and I think there's a real question about how we should preserve cyberspace for peaceful purposes. We've done that in other environments largely, and I think it's incumbent really on the stakeholders of cyberspace, which I think is a very wide community indeed, not to stand up to those who would like to transform this domain into just another battleground. So that's, in a nutshell, where I come from this. I think there's great scope in actually cooperative security arrangements being forged among states. But they will need some pressure to do so, and I think it's particularly vital for civil society, for the private sector, beyond warning of the very useful advice in terms of cyber hygiene and reducing vulnerability, which clearly is desirable, but also to press their governments to be responsible actors in cyberspace rather than irresponsible actors. And I think that's the kind of discourse we should be having much more of now. Thanks.
One of the, one of the things I was going to say, Paul, is I think we also need to remind ourselves that the internet and its predecessor, ARPANET, originally was part of a weapons system.
That's right.
The internet did not start as a peaceful public commons for all citizens of the world. We, the citizens of the world, have essentially been trying to take the internet into the civil domain and create a peaceful space, which can be a public commons. But the internet, its infrastructure, its sole purpose initially was to facilitate a weapon system. And I don't think that we should forget that.
Yeah, though I would make the correction that if you really were trying to protect a weapon system, you would have built in better security from day one. And indeed, one of the issues and problems that have tagged us is that security has only become a relatively recent sort of concern of those using. And of course, I mean, the initial Docker roots was soon sort of transcended and superseded by university researchers around the world who found it a very convenient means of sharing their results. And in that community, of course, they were trusted, and the whole idea of open and transparent research is rather actually critical to the scientific endeavor. So you can sort of understand how it came about. They couldn't have foreseen that we would have literally billions of users now and a great variety. But that aside, I think there are questions of how we can preserve as much of this space for constructive and peaceful activities, and that global society increasingly is dependent on being able to maintain that kind of functionality.
Can I make a comment? Editorial sort of adding to that, thank you. Paul, is as I talked about those third parties and the third parties of third parties, etc., and that whole ecosystem. One of the things that really is also in a deficit is trust. And trust is earned, it's not just declared, right? So the banks, for example, have been in front of the Senate recently, some committee, saying, we want to share information with fintechs, right, which are little startups that can help do things like help automate your application for a credit limit, or et cetera, right? And so there was big sort of questions by the House and the senators about, well, how are you going to manage that data that you might give to those other parties that the customer may not be really aware of or happy about, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, oh, we're going to have contracts and we're going to have the right to audit, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's just not good enough. If you want to trust that, then you actually really need independent assurance of those other parties that have actually got as good a security or better than yours. And the reason you might want better security is if they're a service provider, they may be a service provider to many people. For example, you could have a call center and they're actually doing calls for all the 6 banks. Well, why would I hack the 6 banks? I'll just hack the call center and get all the data from all of them, right? So the service providers can be a nexus, right? And so just sort of like Bonnie and Clyde, why'd you rob the bank? Well, that's where the money was. Well, why'd you hack that call center? Well, that's where all the data is, right? So that there's a concentration risk in some of those service providers as well. And to the degree that exists, that trust actually has to be proven, not just sort of, as I say to people, not a Jedi mind trick, right? Trust me, right? Like Yoda would say, well, these are not the droids you're looking for, right?
Do we have questions?
Three quick questions. What is the risk of terrorists getting control of a nuclear bomb on a missile? What is the risk of governments limiting civilian communication, as in Arab Spring? And can you comment on the dark web, if that's the right term, the criminal internet that operates in the background?
That's an incredibly loaded question. Does either Chris or Paul want to take that question?
Well, I would comment on the first and second, if I might. I think indeed, one of the sort of nightmare scenarios relating to offensive use of cyber is the possibility of interfering with nuclear systems, both nuclear weapon systems in terms of nuclear weapon states, particularly the thought of spoofing early warning systems that could lead to the impression that the state was under attack from its adversary. There's also, frankly, real issues relating to civilian nuclear power plants, particularly given the storage of spent fuel, highly radioactive, in situ on those sites. So that's a whole realm that could keep you up at night if you extrapolate. And indeed, because of the ubiquity of cyber operations, these things become more problematic. On the point about abuse, really, of cyber-enabled surveillance in terms of human rights, it's happening and it's very worrisome. And there's since you're at the University of Toronto, you should all appreciate the excellent work by the Citizen Lab that is based there at the Monk's School, that basically shines light on how the technology has at times been utilized by authoritarian regimes to basically abuse the civil and human rights of their citizens, targeting human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, etc. So, and if you're interested, I would recommend the reports that are generated by the Citizen Lab. So these are real world problems, and we all should be on our guard against them.
The one thing I'll add on the topic of civilians or terrorist organizations engaging in cyber operations. One thing to keep in mind with respect to the current state is, a small group of civilians could very well magnify the effects of their activity to bring down, let's say, some portion of an electrical grid for some period of time. However, in order to take down an entire complex system like the electrical grid, you'll have to conduct simultaneous attacks in different critical points in that grid to then collapse that entire infrastructure at once. The difference is that a portion of the grid going down may affect several communities, and it could be a very large region. But to engage in a large-scale attack against a country requires an immense number of people to be complicit in that sort of attack. You need a lot of individuals who are developing code, weaponizing that code, delivering that sort of attack, weeding their way into the environment so that at the appropriate time, they could then collapse the grid, theoretically. So the likelihood right now of small groups of civilians engaging in full-scale cyber war, I think, is still limited. Cyber war is very much the domain of large nation states that have the money and the resources and the people, the skills to be able to engage in the development of a cyber army, if you will. So, we have seen the devastating effects of small-scale cyber attacks, but full-scale cyber war right now is still very much the domain of nation states, in my opinion.
And so just wait on a sec. So, and just understand, it's not them, it's us. So if you would have heard of Stuxnet, well, that was made by good old Uncle Sam, right? Not some other evil it was our neighbors. And then they were dumb enough to leak the thing out, and that got used by other people, right? So the other thing too is this has been going on, Richard, right? Richard, for a long time. So look up something called Echelon. Echelon, E-C-H-E-L-O-N. This was an agreement post-World War II in the Cold War where 5 countries, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, and the US, said, look, we're Western democracies. We're really good people. We can't spy on our own people. We couldn't do that. That'd be awful. So what they did is they got in a room and said, okay, look, we need to be able to go to our respective parliaments or whatever and say, we're not doing that. But you spy on my people. You spy on his people, you spy on those people, and I'll tell you which people I'm worried about, and you tell me this intel. I can now go to Parliament and say, I ain't spying on my people. Just don't ask me the question as if I asked him to do it for me. So these dirty tricks are being done by us too, being done for decades.
Wow.
A question, this woman in the front.
Okay, so
Yes, thank you.
You had a question.
All right, I do have the floor, do I? Or not?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Ariel, speaking. I feel very much it comes down to the statement that President Kennedy said shortly before he was assassinated. And this was a statement to the United Nations. And I think it is as straightforward as that. Mankind must eliminate war, or war will eliminate mankind. I just wanted to make that simple affirmation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
just to reiterate that, if people haven't heard, so man must eliminate war, or war will eliminate mankind.
Yes, that's right.
And there was a woman in the rear. Oh, your neighbor. Okay.
So clearly from the headlines, the state of security on the internet is perhaps disastrous is overstating it, but certainly dangerous. To what extent is this due to commercial pressures? The abdication of liability, the pressures to just get things out cheap and fast, and security is at most an afterthought. So that's one speaker who kind of put it there. And how much of this current state of affairs is due to the intelligence agencies of countries like the Five Eyes, like the US, of Russia, of China, that both A, force companies to put vulnerabilities into their products so that they can be exploited, and B, find vulnerabilities in other products and don't tell anyone so that they can exploit it. So they are only looking at offensive and invest little to no resources in increasing the defenses or general security of online. And so like I'd like to, like, how are those balanced? Are they equal? Is it far more one or the other?
So I can just address that immediate question that you had, the latter part. So having engaged in working with intelligence organizations that do get involved in this sort of activity, looking for vulnerabilities and weaponizing these vulnerabilities into cyber weapons, you know, there are folks out there that want to do harm to people, and we are organized into nation states right now. And the people trust that their government are doing things to protect their safety and security, and part of that is protecting against cyber attack. One aspect of preventing a nation state from attacking our infrastructure is developing a deterrence mechanism so that it becomes very expensive for that other nation state to attack us. Because if we have the capability to respond, then that would deter them from you know, engaging in large-scale attacks against us, similar to what has happened with the use of nuclear weapons, you know, mutual annihilation. So this is the prevailing philosophy that we have. And I think until we work towards a greater peace in the world, it's going to be very difficult for nation states to walk back from that, because there have been nation states like China and Iran who have demonstrated their willingness to engage in offensive attacks against other countries around the world. Russia has clearly demonstrated their interest in oppressing other countries in their region in order to gain dominance in that regional space. So, you know, how do you prevent an organization or a country like Russia from doing that? Deterrence, unfortunately, is the only means that we have today. So that's the reason for the state of things that we have. What we do about it is certainly the interesting questions. There has not been any consensus at the international level on what do we do about this current state. How do we walk ourselves back from an increasing arms race in cyber? And this is something that I think organizations like Science for Peace need to start tackling, because I can tell you from an industry perspective, we don't have very good answers. Evan? Is your name Evan? No? Yes, you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I guess I have two issues that I also wanted to have discussed. One is, again, like talked about in the previous session about AI, but in particular, its relevance with respect to drones. I know there was a video not too long ago that was a pretty disturbing one regarding how drones could potentially be manipulated and used for rather disturbing uses. And the question would be regarding possibility of a global convention or something to prevent the development of those types of AI-based technologies. And the second thing would be regarding emerging, I guess, internet-based systems like blockchain and those similar trust-based systems, and how they might be able to address or not some of these security issues.
Chris, did you want to comment on blockchain?
Yeah, sure. Blockchain is going to have its purposes, but you know, and I'm actually an accountant by trade, so you know, you'd think I'd like money and all that sort of stuff, but I like real money, and you know, Bitcoin and all that sort of stuff, you know, that gets enabled by blockchain. Now I'm with the Warren Buffett side of the house on that one right now. I know that sounds very conservative, but blockchain actually, if properly implemented, would create the ability to trust many things, right? But note what I said. So the design and architecture of it all is actually quite cool in terms of the ability to preserve the integrity of certain information and bind it to other things logically, right? And to sort of do it and grow an ecosystem. Now, putting aside the computing power required and all that, it's got some certain opportunities to transform how we can trust certain things in the cyber realm, for sure. But it has to be implemented correctly, and it has to be set up right. The code has to be written right. The algorithms used in the encryption have to be right. You know, eventually, encryption. You know, many encryption algorithms have been proven to be breakable and have been broken over time. So this thing's got a good life for a while, but I'm not sure how long. That'd be my case.
On the, just to finish the other question about drones and using AI-enabled swarms to sort of attack a region, what have you. Certainly, there has not been any real serious discussion about the use of autonomous weapon systems, and you know that would fit into that sort of category, where you know robotic weapon systems are auto-targeting and making decisions themselves about what to shoot at and what to not shoot at. The UN, most recently, I was reading in the news probably about 3 to 6 weeks ago, has started to open up the dialogue about these semi-autonomous and autonomous robotic weapon systems. You know, got to figure out what to do with them. And you know, God forbid we have a situation where a nation state co-opts somebody else's robotic semi-autonomous weapon system and conducts an operation. So, I mean, these are serious questions. The U.S. has had one of the Predator drones hacked by a terrorist organization out in the theater of war, and that drone was essentially crash landed. Now, of course, there was Iran is the nation state that helped to fuel Hezbollah's ability to hijack that drone in that particular instance. But it just does demonstrate that the issues that you're bringing to the fore are real issues that could cause real harm. We haven't seen what large-scale cyber war looks like. But I can tell you, there's a heck of a lot of civilian infrastructure that has to be co-opted in order to engage in large-scale cyber war. There are civilians that need to be co-opted to engage in large-scale cyber war. We haven't yet seen what cyber war looks like, but we have seen a little bit of a taste of what it could look like from Russia activity in the lead up to the U.S. election, which, might I add, if anybody was watching Mexico 2 to 3 years earlier, everything that Russia had done in the U.S. with respect to their Twitter bot empire, they had tested out in Mexico City 2 to 3 years ahead of time. And it was highly successful in manipulating regional elections across Mexico City. So U.S. is in my opinion, is a test run. I think we'll see what Russia has in store for tomorrow, in my opinion.
Yes, the key word in my question is superintelligence. It's a word that's cropping up more and more. I originally came across it in a statement from Stephen Hawking, and later an independent statement from the retired multi-billionaire of Microsoft, where they both said that things are moving much faster than they had anticipated in the area of robotics and artificial intelligence. Therefore, we should be paying close attention and having discussions about what kind of a society do we want, because these are really going to affect us. Now, the word superintelligence implies that we get to a certain level of dependency on computers, and computer development gets us to the point where computers are responding to computers. The human is not in the equation. How does that statement look to you?
So AI comes up a lot. I think we need to be really realistic about what artificial intelligence is today. And when we say artificial intelligence, what we're really talking about is machine learning algorithms. And what that means is that machines are, instead of being trained to model data and then find similar examples of that model, we're giving examples of the result that we want. And we're telling the systems to use algorithms to figure it out. So essentially, machine learning is developing iterations of code to conceptualize some form of complexity. It's pattern matching on a very advanced level. We are very, very far from actual artificial intelligence. However, just the ability to encapsulate and describe complexity allows us to do some pretty interesting, exciting, and devastating things with artificial intelligence. I don't know if anybody saw a video of an entirely artificial graphics of President Obama artificially saying words that he had never said before. So it was an entire video stream that is almost indistinguishable to the eye. It looks like a real video of President Obama that is completely artificially constructed. So that's an amazing example of what machine learning algorithms can accomplish. But I think the days where we have the robot uprising and the Terminator scenario with Skynet and what have you, I still think that that's far away. But humans can do some pretty interesting things with that. Just imagine what happened at the lead up of the US election with fake Twitter profiles. Well, what if we had fake people on video? What if we created video of our leaders engaging activities that they didn't engage in? How long would it take for the public to realize that was just a fraudulent video? We're coming very close to a period in time where fact and fiction are going to be indistinguishable. I mean, we trust what we see generally. If there's a video of some sort of atrocity that had occurred, we trust it because we captured it on camera. But I can guarantee you that probably 3 to 5 years from now, we will have completely fictitious videos of events that have never occurred that are going to spark conflict around the world. I can probably guarantee that that's the future that we're moving towards.
Can you talk about quantum computing and who owns the quantum computers in the world right now and how they're forcing encryption and security to change?
China. China is setting the standards for quantum computing. They've been able to entangle the most amount of qubits. We're about half the way there. I think our record at the Perimeter Institute is 12 or 13, and China is somewhere in the range of approaching 20. When we get to 30, entanglements, that's when we start to exceed the modern computing power that we have today, which means that there are encryption algorithms that protect our most prized secrets that will begin to fail and be utterly useless at that point. But that's not as interesting to me as the nexus between artificial intelligence and driven by quantum computing. So right now, China is the dominant player. They are now starting to set the standards in the space of quantum computing. So I think that they will, unless the U.S. makes a concerted effort to engage in massive research to catch up and win that war, so to speak, China may very well emerge in the next decade as the victor in that sense. And they will have capabilities that we will have to spend the next 10 years to catch up. So that's what the future of quantum computing looks like to be from my perspective.
And what do the victories and capabilities look like?
With a completely fictitious video of things that have never occurred that are completely indistinguishable from the eye. Being able to crack encryption. You know, China's probably collecting encrypted messages from the US that they have no intention of cracking today. They want to crack 30 years from now. But those secrets may still be highly relevant 30 years from now. So imagine a scenario where the US right now has communications that are intercepted that shed light on events in a very different light. You know, perhaps conflict around the world that we think was started one way, but our intelligence services have found out it was started in a completely different way. Imagine if that information was revealed to the public 30 years from now, and how that would completely change our perception of the last 30 years of history. You know, that's what future cyber war looks like. And do we still have time for more? Or?
Well, I want one.
Sorry about that.
You said the only thing we've got going for us now is deterrence. And at the same podium a year and a half ago, Paul Meyer said the UN has formed a panel of, he calls them GGEs, essentially governmental experts, to develop a system of regulation. I don't know whether it would look like a treaty or what, but it would be a set of agreements among countries that they will behave themselves according to certain standards that they set up. And that function for, they worked on it, they put some time in on it, and then it got left on the shelf someplace and hasn't been completed. I assume that Paul has left us. I don't see him. And if Paul, if you're with us, it would be nice to have you comment on that again. And also, I think Jack Gemmell, who wrote the paper Foresight Expertise as a submission to a defense policy review. I believe it was a cyber defense or something a year or two ago. Paul's position was very similar, I think, to Paul. Jackson's similar to Paul's. But you know, I'm not qualified to say that. It would be nice if either of them could be here, but you probably had that conversation with them, and you can elaborate.
The group of governmental experts panel, this was an interesting case because it was originally started by the Russian Federation. It was an effort to define what norms of behavior are acceptable and not acceptable in cyberspace, essentially. So there was some consensus arrived in some of these discussions that some areas, you know, this is where we should focus our efforts. And it's just interesting to see that today, despite the fact that the old Russian Federation had started this effort, you know, the modern Russian nation state today is really not following the advice of their predecessor. I think it's critically important. I think this is where the discussion needs to start. At the international level, we need to define norms of behavior, because until we start to define where that dividing line is, what is acceptable, what is not, what is a cyber attack, how do we know that we've been attacked, how do we respond to these attacks, what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. Until we codify that into some form of international law, we are essentially going to have a system of anarchy reign, where it's just mutual relationships between nation states deciding amongst themselves what to do and what is acceptable, and then enforcing that system by using their network of influence against those who step out of line. I mean, this is essentially what we have right now in the global sphere, just between nation states. There's no democratic governing structure of the world. I mean, this is also something that's near and dear to my heart as a director in the World Federalist Movement, the Toronto chapter. You know, these are the kinds of big global problems that we need to get nations around the world, parliamentarians from each of these nations around the world, to have a space where we can debate and make laws that are binding upon all nation states in a fair and equitable and democratic manner. and that we have the apparatus to enforce those laws at the international level. Until we arrive at that stage, many of the complex issues that we've discussed today are going to be issues of grave concern that never get solved. So I think that is the best possible way for us to solve a myriad of these issues. How do we stop war? How do we stop genocide? How do we deal with the environment and protect our environment and protect human rights? I believe we need to move towards a system of global governance that's fair and democratic, that nations give up their external sovereignty to maintain their internal sovereignty, but insofar as they want to use their military to engage in these sorts of activities, they need to be prevented from doing that, or at least there needs to be a system in place for us to deal with those situations at the global level. So that's just my closing remarks.
It's not just.